So Chapter 11, Key Issue 4, is about the changing distribution of industry within the U.S., the reasons for the emergence of new industrial regions, and why might industry move back into traditional industrial regions. And so when we look at changes for industry within developed regions, we're going to focus on the U.S., but these trends can be seen throughout Europe as well. So industrialization during the late 19th and early 20th century largely bypassed the American South because the South didn't have the necessary infrastructure to build all the power plants. It didn't have enough electrical power plants, enough coal-burning power plants. It didn't have enough train tracks. It didn't have even a well-established network of highways initially. So the North and the Northeast definitely had that infrastructure already established. This would be true in more rural agricultural areas in Europe as well. So the South was still predominantly agricultural. The North was predominantly industrial. Over time, the establishment of states within the United States as right-to-work states means that industry has shifted from the Northeast towards the South and the West. And so if you look at a map in 1950, you don't see any of the right-to-work states marked. And you can see that most of the industry is here in the Northeast to the early parts of the Midwest, so ending in about Illinois, and of course in California as a West Coast center. And then the South is primarily agricultural, and the West in the 1950s was either agricultural or uninhabited, depending on where you were living. By 2010, you'll notice that we started to lose jobs from the Northeast, and they started to shift down further south a little bit, over to like Texas, more to California. Some of these western states here increased in their manufacturing as well. And you can see the states that have more manufacturing now than before. Many of them are right-to-work states. Right-to-work states traditionally have lower wages for employees, but they are attractive to businesses because the unions don't have as much strength, so you don't have to worry about as many problems with bargaining for employee rights with the unions, bargaining for things like wages and benefits with the union. And in a right-to-work state, wages are typically lower. So all of these countries with blue diamonds on them traditionally have lower wages than non-right-to-work states. And we get more and more right-to-work states as states begin to compete. So if you're competing with opening an industry here, and you're Illinois and Indiana's a right-to-work state, companies might begin to locate their plants over here instead. Same goes with Michigan. Like Michigan or Wisconsin, if they became right-to-work states, then you maybe would start to lose industry. We also have new industrial regions. So things like transnational corporations are embracing using low-cost labor in developing countries. So since the 1950s, and it really took off in the 1960s, we began outsourcing our labor. And so we started to build factories in less developed countries, and this means that we could pay the workers less. So our heyday of a manufacturing in the United States was in the 1950s. And so from the 1950s on, we've been losing manufacturing jobs to developing countries. And part of that makes sense. At their stage in development, right, they're entering the stage of development we were in, about 100 years ago. So it makes sense that if you're a country that's rapidly developing now, that you're going to have rapid urbanization, rapid population growth. And these conditions mean that you really have a lot of labor, and sometimes a lot of low-skilled labor, because you don't have the infrastructure in place to educate your rapidly growing population yet. And so this large population of mostly unskilled laborers means that you have a population that's really primed for working in manufacturing. And the fact that you are not paying people as much means that companies are saving money. which is part of why you can buy so much stuff for so cheap. You can see here from 1995 to 2010, the percent of trousers, blouses, shirts, underwear, bras, all of that has been on the decline in the United States since 1995. And it was on the decline before that. When we talk about emerging industrial revolutions, we need to also talk about Mexico. So Mexico and the NAFTA agreement, the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, which is something that's been spoken about a lot last year or so. The North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement was an agreement between the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And what it meant is that we had free trade between these three countries. And there's a lot of pros and cons to this plan. Mexico attracted a lot of labor-intensive industries because of its relatively low cost. So it's close to the U.S. and its labor costs less than hiring workers in the U.S. or Canada. So a lot of manufacturing began to shift south to Mexico. These factories were called maquiladoros, and the maquiladoros are something where you get maybe the raw material from the U.S., but it's manufactured in Mexico and then shipped back to the U.S. and Canada. NAFTA really allowed this to happen because there were no tariffs or taxes placed on the products produced in Mexico as they're sent back to the U.S. So if you hear someone talking about taxing automobiles that are made in Mexico and shipped back into the U.S., that would be a violation of NAFTA. And there's a lot of good things about NAFTA. So NAFTA increased trade between the U.S. and Mexico, between the U.S. and Canada, and really across all three nations. The U.S. unions lost some leverage, and I'm very pro-union, but it meant that unions were kind of, they're a force that needs a check as well. I like a system of checks and balances. So it provided a check to the power of unions without having to disassemble them or get rid of them. It was a way to bargain back with the unions without necessarily having to make your state a right-to-work state. And the average wages in the U.S. increased because the jobs we were getting were higher skilled jobs. So the manufacturing we still do in the U.S. is primarily higher skilled manufacturing. So our average wages went up, and the wages of people in Mexico working in these factories went up. What are some negatives? We lost jobs in the U.S. You can't shift a manufacturing center further into another country without losing jobs. And it definitely took a while for people to kind of catch up and train them and move them into new jobs, but hopefully higher wage ones. It also allowed the U.S. to really exploit immigrants. It also allows Mexico to exploit immigrants from Guatemala and Honduras and other Central American countries. Some of the factories in the U.S., some of the lower, more traditional manufacturing centers, their wages didn't increase. So while highly skilled manufacturing jobs meant to an increase in wages, if you're working at a zipper making factory in the U.S., your wages didn't increase. So they stayed low. So factory workers now don't make much more money than they would have, 20 or 30 years ago. So your wages aren't keeping up with your cost of living. And some other negatives is that it really shifted a lot of the industrial pollution into Mexico because there were less regulations. And as a result of NAFTA, 1 million Mexican farmers lost their jobs because of the cheap government-subsidized corn that poured into Mexico from the U.S. So there were people in Mexico who also lost jobs. If you look at this map, it shows you NAFTA-related job losses since 1993. I don't remember what year this figure is from, but you can see areas that lost the most jobs: California, Texas, Florida. Texas and California were some pretty big industrial hubs. The Northeast, all the way up to Illinois, where many of the factories were, including things like automobile factories. And then in areas that were, increasing the amount of manufacturing they were doing. And then, your North Dakota, South Dakota, Idaho, who really lost about 800 to 2,900 jobs. So they haven't really lost any jobs to Mexico up here. But look at what happened to our trade. So trilateral, looking at U.S., Mexico, and Canada trade, it increased from $300 million in 1990 to over $900 million in 2008. Between the U.S. and Canada, we increased from $200 million in trade to about $550 million in trade. U.S. and Mexico, look at that increase, from under $100 million in trade to almost $400 million in trade. And Mexico and Canada definitely increased their trade, but not as much as the U.S. did with Canada and the U.S. did with Mexico. And so if you look at overall like trade dollars flowing between countries, the United States is the clear beneficiary of NAFTA. So what you have to look at is, are you looking at NAFTA as something that's benefiting the consumer or benefiting the worker? And is there a way where you can balance it out? So right now, NAFTA clearly benefits the large corporation owners, and it clearly benefits the consumers. So if you're buying something that was made at a maquiladora, you're paying less for it. So it's benefiting you as you're shopping. But if you work maybe like in an automobile factory, NAFTA maybe didn't benefit you. But I don't know if there's anything there's any going back now, because the trade agreement was formed in the 1990s. Now it's 2017. So I don't know if we're ever going to get those jobs back at wages that would even help you earn a living wage in the United States. So the real problem is that damage already done? Can you bring those factory jobs back to the U.S.? Those lower skill, lower wage jobs. And if you do, are they the kind of jobs that we even want here? Like, will you be able to support a family and survive on them? And the answer is probably not. So really, you want to look at how can we change situation and site factors so we have an economy that's thriving on industry, but also thriving on agriculture and service-based economies. So we want to look at how can we bring industry back into traditional industrial regions. And this is the big puzzle, right? How can you bring industry back to Pennsylvania? How can you bring industry back to Ohio? How can you bring jobs back? Because I don't think people really care if they work in a zipper factory or if they're building wind turbines. Like, they want to work and they want to be able to pay their bills and they want to have a good quality of life. So what is the benefit to having a factory in Pennsylvania where you're going to have to pay workers so much more money than you would have to if you opened your factory in India or South Korea or Mexico? So you will have greater availability of skilled labor in the traditional industrial regions, particularly with a push in vocational trades and industry level certifications. So this skilled labor, of which we have a shortage of in many areas in the United States, depending on what sector you're looking at in the economy, this highly skilled labor means that if you want to build medical equipment, you might want to have your factory in the United States. If you're going to build wind turbines, the U.S. may be a better fit for you. And rapid delivery to the market. So if you're building medical equipment, it might make sense to have your factory located near like a research hospital hub.